On this week's episode, we're going to be making Hong Kong-style wonton soup. It's a classic traditional dish of very simple but flavorful broth with filled dumplings. For this dish, we're going to need a ham hock, ground pork, soy sauce, sesame oil, shiitake mushrooms, Napa cabbage, wonton wrappers, leeks, chives, fresh ginger, fresh garlic, and chicken bones. Today we're going to be making the Hong Kong style wontons, and it's served in a traditional broth. You'll see variations of wontons coming from Chinese cuisine and spread all throughout Asia, and largely it's the same concept. You've got a dumpling with a filling. It's probably either pork or shrimp or a combination of both with some flavors in it. And then a broth. And that's where each chef in the different regions will sort of put their own little twist or spin on it. So mine is inspired by Hong Kong with a little bit of my twist on it. So we're going to start off with a little bit of pork product. If you look at traditional Hong Kong cuisine, they often use a local ham, which is very difficult to find in the US. So I like to use ham hocks. You can also substitute country ham, and both of those work equally well. The nice thing about ham hocks is not only do you bring in that nicely cured, salty pork flavor, but you also bring in some of that smokiness. To extract the flavor a little bit better, it's a good idea to cut up the meat a little bit. So I'm just going to cut it up into big chunks, and we'll add that to our pot. I'm going to get about a half gallon of water. And then from here you can decide if you want to use shrimp shells, dried fish, chicken bones. I've got a little bit of chicken bones today that I'm going to add to it. So the broth is going to be based primarily on the ham hocks and chicken bones. And these are just bones left over from cutting up fresh whole chickens. I remove the breasts, legs, and thighs, and we have nothing but the carcasses left. If you don't tend to cut up whole chickens yourself, you could always purchase chicken bones. They're relatively inexpensive. The best part are the backbones. They have lots of flavor, and the backbones have a lot of gelatin in them, which really contributes a wonderful body and texture to the final broth. Once we've got all the ingredients in the pot, we're going to bring this up to a boil. And once it is boiled, we're going to discard the water, rinse off the bones, and then we'll add the rest of the ingredients. And the reason why we do that is because the first time that the bones and the meat come to a boil, there's a lot of salt in the water coming off of the ham, and we like to get rid of that so that the broth isn't too salty. And then also, you get a lot of impurities, and that can make your broth look kind of cloudy. And the goal is that we have a flavorful, clear broth that's attractive and pleasing to the eye. So that's why we throw away the first batch of water. Now that the water has come to a boil, you can see that a lot of the impurities that were making the broth cloudy have collected on the surface in a sort of like the foam on the crest of a wave. And we're going to discard that first batch of water. So I'm just going to drain the meat and the bones out. And if you wanted to, you could save this broth and use it for something that doesn't have to be clear. For example, rice or a bean soup. All right, now I'm going to give the meat and the bones a little bath to rinse off any more of those impurities. And we'll put everything back into our pot. Add some fresh water. Now we can add some of our aromatics. So I've got some shiitake mushrooms, fresh garlic, ginger, and you can use either green onions or, in my case, I chose to use leeks. Just going to cut off the root end, cut off the green tops. Split the leek open, cut it into chunks. If it's dirty, give it a little wash. And for the mushrooms, you can use any kind of mushrooms you'd like. At home, a lot of times I like to use dried mushrooms because they're convenient and they last forever, and it's wonderful for using in broths and stocks. Another thing that you can do is if you have mushrooms and you're not going to use the stems for something, you can use the stems for flavoring your broth. Rather than putting the entire mushroom in, I'll just tear off the stems. And that's a great use for shiitake mushroom stems because they tend to be a little too woody and chewy in texture. But they do have a lot of flavor, so it's an ideal candidate for using in a broth to extract all that flavor. And mushrooms really go a long way towards enhancing the flavor of meat broths. Anytime you're making something where you want to bring out that meaty umami flavor, mushrooms are always a good choice. For the garlic, I'm just going to cut off the top, a little bit of the root, and I'm going to split it in half and just put the entire head of garlic into the broth. For the ginger, I'm going to use about a 3-inch piece. And again, we can peel it. Maybe cut off some of those knobs if they're in your way. Cut that into chunks and add to your broth. Then you let the broth cook for about an hour and a half to extract the full flavor. We'll strain it, season it, and then we'll serve that with our wontons. Now we're ready to make the filling, and we got a few ingredients. I'm going to start with a little bit of ginger. All right. I'm going to use a couple of pieces of this. I need about 2 inches of ginger. So we'll peel it, and then we're going to mince it up very, very finely. All right, so now that we have the ginger peeled, I'm going to split it in half, slice it very, very thinly. Ginger is very fibrous, kind of chewy in texture, almost like celery. So the thinner you slice it, the more tender it is. So now I'm just going to cut those slices into thin strips. Stack them all up, rotate the strips, and then we're going to cut them into small dice. All right, put the ginger in the bowl. Next, we're going to need a little bit of garlic. I'm going to use 3 cloves, or toes, as they're sometimes referred to. Cut off the root end of each clove. And then just give them a gentle tap to crack the clove, and that'll help release the skin. right? And then we're just going to smash the garlic on the board. You want the garlic very, very finely chopped. All right. I also use the side of my blade to sort of scrape and smash the garlic a little bit, and that just helps get a much finer texture. All right. Add that to the bowl. We can add our pork. And then we're also going to need some chives. So I'm going to get about a dozen chives. Cut them in half. And then I'm going to slice them very, very thinly. If you can find yellow chives in your market, they're very common in Hong Kong. But if not, you can use green onions. In my case, I've got green chives. You could even use scallions, shallots, yellow or white onions. Any sort of onion products would work just fine. I'll get a spatula. A couple tablespoons of soy sauce. Tablespoon and a half of sesame oil. And then we're going to mix the ingredients together. And you really want to make sure that these get mixed very evenly. I like to use a spatula for this and do it by hand. If you have a mixer, you can put it in a mixer with a paddle attachment. But, you know, it's very convenient and easy when you're doing a small batch just to mix it with a spoon or a spatula. All right, and all I do is just fold it over and smash it and fold and repeat until you can see all the ingredients have been thoroughly mixed. It's always a good idea to check the seasoning to make sure that you got enough soy sauce in there, enough sesame oil, enough of everything. A convenient way to do that, just take a small piece of the filling and cook it. You can cook it in the microwave, you can drop it into your broth for a few minutes and then pull it out. You could even just sear it in a pan, but either way, it's a good idea to make sure that you taste your filling, just to make sure that you have adequate amounts of seasoning and make adjustments if necessary. So I'll take just a small little piece, like half a teaspoon, and I'll put it right into my broth and let that cook there for about a minute or so until all the color is gone. So for the dumplings, I'm going to choose some wrappers. Hong Kong style wonton wrappers are really, really thin. You can use regular wonton wrappers, you can use dumpling wrappers. Today I have the circular shaped dumpling or wonton wrappers. They work quite well. You could even make your own wrappers. It's just a simple egg pasta dough. Okay. By now my filling should be ready to sample. Maybe just a little bit more soy sauce. Okay. So now we're going to put the filling into a pastry bag. I'm using disposable pastry bags, which is a good idea when you're working with raw meat fillings. cut a hole about a half of an inch wide into the bag. All right. And when you grab the bag, grab it between your thumb and your index finger, wrap it around, and twist until the filling just starts to come out from the pressure. And then when you need to dispense a little bit of the filling, you just squeeze with your right hand. So I'll put about a teaspoon of filling into the center of each wrapper. I press down on the dough with the bag so that I can pull away without making a mess with the filling. If you don't press down to pinch off the filling, you can end up spreading it all over the table. When you're shaping these, you'll need either a little bit of egg, or in my case, I'm going to use water. And I'm just going to brush it along one half of the dough. And I'll take the half that is not wet, and I'll fold it over and press to crease the edges. The idea is you want to push out all of the air and make sure that the edges are well sealed. And I'll put just a tip of water, and bring the edges together and fold. And that's one of the classic wonton shapes. All right, so again, just brush along the bottom edge, push out all of the air, a little bit of water right on the tip, and fold them together. If you're fast enough, you can probably wet a couple and then shape them immediately before they dry out. And it's one thing to think about when you're working with any sort of a pasta dough. It can dry very easily if you let it sit out for too long. So don't put out more than you can assemble in a few minutes. If you are going to have to step away from it and it's going to be sitting for too long, just get some damp paper towels and put it over the top of the dough to keep it moist so it doesn't dry out. If it dries out, when you're trying to shape the wontons, they'll crack. And if they crack, they fall apart when you cook them. The filling spills out and you don't have a dumpling. And you will see different shapes of wontons. Some are very simple. I like this one a lot because it's rather pretty. Now that we got all of our wontons shaped and filled, we're ready to cook them. Our broth is also almost ready. And the last thing we have to do is to prepare some of the vegetables. So I've got a big pot of boiling water, and the key here is big pot of boiling water. Do not try to do this in a tiny little pot. One of the problems when trying to cook pasta, dumplings, raviolis, anything like that is if you put everything into the pot and the pot stops boiling, you put too much. Right? So the general rule of thumb is we usually use a ratio. A minimum of 8 parts water to 1 part pasta. So if you've got a pound of dry spaghetti that you're going to cook, you need 8 pounds of water, which is a gallon of water. So make sure you got plenty of water for what you're trying to make. Once you've put all of the wontons into the boiling water, it should take about 5 minutes for them to cook. And make sure that it stays at a nice rolling boil. One of the things about keeping it boiling is that if it's boiling, all of the bubbles, right, all the convection movement, help to sort of shake everything up and move things around so that they cook evenly And also so that they don't stick together, because if the wontons stick together, when you separate them, they're going to rupture, the filling's going to fall out. And then also the point where they were touching when they were stuck together is going to take twice as long to cook as the rest of it. So you'll have some inconsistencies in the pasta itself. Maybe even raw dough, that would be worse. All right, so while that's cooking, we've got some mushrooms. I'm going to cut those into quarters. We already used the stems in the broth. Got a little bit of Napa cabbage. I'm just going to peel off a few leaves of this. Stack them up. Split it right down the middle. Trim off the ends. And I'm going to cut it into about 1 to 1.5 inch size pieces. We've also got a little bit of chives, or green onions if you have, for garnish. Just gives it a little bit of color and some of that fresh onion flavor. I'm just going to cut these really, really thinly. And we can strain the broth. And I'm going to use a ladle to skim off any excess fat. And the end result should be a pretty clear and very flavorful broth. It's a good idea to check your seasoning and make sure there's plenty of salt. And that ham contributed just the perfect amount. I'm going to put enough for a portion in the pot. Bring it to a boil. And I'll add some of the mushrooms. Let them begin to cook. The wontons, you can tell when they're starting to get cooked, when they go from sort of a opaque, yellowish look to a little more translucent and not so yellow. And it looks like they're almost done. All right. So I'll go ahead and pull these out. And I'll go ahead and add my cabbage to the pot. Get a bowl. I'll arrange 5 wontons in the bowl. A ladle or 2 of the broth. Some of the cabbage and mushrooms, and a little bit of chives right over the wontons.